Hey everybody, welcome to another live stream here at Electrical Code Academy Incorporated. My name is Paul Abernathy. If you don't know who I am the founder and CEO of Electrical Code Academy Incorporated, and we teach the National Electrical Code. I've been doing it for about 38 years now, and I serve on 2 code making panels. So I've been involved in the NEC for quite a long time, and we love bringing you content where we can teach you something about the National Electrical Code. Now, today's episode, we're going to be talking single family dwelling calculations. We're going to be doing the standard method. And there's a reason for that. The reason you need to understand the standard method is obviously sizing neutral conductors to be accurate. You need to know how to do the standard method. But also, when it comes to exam preparation, you definitely want to make sure that you understand how to do it because that is what typically you're going to see on exams is they're going to ask you any potential element when it comes to a single family dwelling calculation, whether or not they want to ask you something as simple as the appliances and understanding 220 the 220 article specifically dealing with 220.53 for the appliances. They might ask you a dryer question in 220.54. They might ask you a range question, 220.55. Any little piece they may ask you. And so you got to remember that at the end of the day, anything could be brought up. So that's something you have to be aware of. Okay, so today we're doing the standard method. If you were looking for something other than the standard method, it's not the webinar for you. We'll catch you on another webinar. But that's what we're focusing on today. Okay. All right, so let's go on and get into the material. We will look at the NEC and look and see what's involved in the NEC. Again, this webinar is based on the 2023 edition of the NEC. So I'm not going to be talking about the 2020, and I'm not going to be talking about 2017. So again, same information is in there. You're just going to have to know that some of the numbers have changed when it comes to the 2017, 2020 versus the 2023. Okay, so that's what our focus is going to be on today. All right, so we're going to be looking at it, and we're going to be doing it from a very practical. You probably have seen me use this examples before. You can post your questions in the chat feature. I will get to them as I get to them and be able to give you some additional insight on it. But again, we are focusing on the topic at hand, which is single family dwelling standard method. So I'm not entertaining questions outside of the topic of the webinar. I've got 2 hours. I want to make sure I cover everything in that time frame. And we should be able to finish with enough time for me to answer any questions or give you some additional insight. Okay, so on an exam, they could ask you anything about a single family dwelling calculation. And in the standard method, it's not going to yield the best result in the real world like an optional method would do, right? But in a standard method, they're going to ask certain different things. Now, the optional method is much easier. If you fumble up on the optional method, then you really need to take a step back, right? So, because if you think about it, with the optional method, you're simply taking the nameplates of everything. And you don't have to worry about the first 3,000 at 100%, the next 117,000 at 35%, anything over that at 20. You really are just taking the nameplate values from everything. And then when it comes to heat versus AC, you're taking either 100% of the AC versus a different variations of the heat and see which is larger. So you take the first 10,000 at 100% and everything after that is at 40%. And then of course you do the heat versus AC, whichever is larger. So that one's pretty straightforward. And we can cover that in another episode pretty quickly. The standard method, we want to make sure because of the little pieces that are involved in it, that's why we want to spend a little extra time on that scenario. So the first thing you got to deal with is, where do I begin? Where do I even start? So on an exam versus real world, in fact, funny part is I'm doing a calculation as we speak for my brother. We've got a big 10,000 square foot house that he's wiring. And you really have to have all of the variables to do a accurate load calculation. That's the first thing that I want to, that I typically talk about for people is it's hard for you to do. On exam, it's easy because they give you all the info. Otherwise, you can't do the calc. In the real world, it's tough, right? Because I need to know the rating of the dishwasher. I need to know what the disposer is. I need to know what ranges. Is it gas? Is it electric? So you have to put a lot of pressure on the design, the builder, the homeowner. Unless you're just used to doing houses of a certain size that you can just do rule of thumb and say, yeah, this looks like this would be a 200 amp service, or this looks like it'd be a 400 amp service. That type of thing. The house that I'm calculating out with my brother, that's nearly a 10,000 square foot dwelling, and it only needs a 400 amp service using the optional method. Probably would be larger using the standard method, but you're permitted to use the optional, okay? So we're looking at standards simply from an exam prep scenario, but optional methods will be covered in another webinar, most certainly, because we want to make sure we cover it all. Also, if you're a member of Fast Track's Tube, we actually have videos already on single family, both the optional and standard methods. So go check those out over on Fast Track's Tube if you have it. All right. So we have to know the outside dimensions of the actual structure. And we also need to know what is not to be included in your calculation. In other words, opened porches are not to be included in your square footage in the 2023 edition of the NEC. But an unfinished basement, which is adaptable for future use, you do have to take that square footage into consideration. Okay, so all of that's fair game. All right, now in the 2023, guess what? Even your garage square footage has to be taken into consideration. Okay, there is a lot of people that are actually adapting their garage as a habitable space or for future use that is not just a garage. So that was a change in the 2023 to remove garage from the list of things which you exclude from your square footage, right? So that means that it's got to be included in my calculation. Again, if you come in late to this webinar, remember, we are talking 2023 edition. That's it today. It's nearly impossible for me to try to cover all 3 cycles in one webinar. All right. So in today's webinar, we are going to look at a house that has these things that we have collected. We have pulled these things together. We know the outside dimensions of the dwelling, which is 35 by 55 foot. So it looks to me like a rancher. We do know that there is a front porch that is 7 feet by 10 feet. Okay, so we're gonna know that that's not going to be included in our square footage, but we got to see how we do that. In our case, we have 4 small appliance brand circuits. Of course, you all know that the NEC demands a minimum of 2 small appliance brand circuits. And if you're doing a load calculation on an exam and they're asking you to do an entire load calc, and they want you to do the entire load for the dwelling, you have to assume at least 2 small appliance brand circuits at 1500 VA each. And you also have to assume at least 1 laundry circuit at 1500 VA each, okay, or for that one. Now, our dwelling has 2 laundry brand circuits. We have 4 small appliance brand circuits. So keep that in mind as we go through. Also, I will tell you that today, while I'm going through it, I will also be filling out our sheet. If you're a Fast Tracks member, you're fully aware by now of these sheets. So these sheets are a little kind of keeps track and kind of helps you learn the different steps through it and that type of thing. Let's see here. Oh, I did see a comment. I haven't been watching the comments. Logical 4 says, I'm not trying to be combative with my comment. Oh, no worries. I didn't take it as any combating. I was just glancing up at it to let you know that we do have optional videos for optional calculations over on Fast Track's Tube. If you're a member, go watch them there. But we will be doing an optional series here in the future as well. That one just maybe not going to take 2 hours to do because it's much, much easier to do the optional. calculation. All right, so anyway, so no, didn't take it anyway as combative. All right, so we've got, what else do we have here? So let's look at our list. We know we got a water heater, which is an appliance. And it is 4.5 kW, or as y'all all know, I like it to be 4,500 VA, 240 volts. So just remember, that's not going to be in our neutral calculation. That's only going to be in our ungrounded hot conductor calculation. We have a 10 amp dishwasher, which we're going to have to convert to VA. And y'all know how to do that, right? The amps times the volts is going to give us a VA value that we're working with. You should always know that to convert and get, you got to work in the VA. So that's how we convert VA. Next, we have an in-sink waste disposer, and this one is given to us in horsepower. And this is the only one today that's given to us in horsepower. But it's good that we look at this one because I'm going to show you how to convert this and get it to VA when you may have something in horsepower given on your electrical exam, all right? And in the real world, you're still going to have to do the same thing, right? You're still going to have to take a horsepower, you're going to have to convert it to get a VA value so that you can do your load calculation, okay? Makes sense? All right, let's see here, hold on. Just making sure this is going, and it looks like it is, okay. All right, so let's do the next thing we've got here. Okay, so we got a trash compactor. That is an appliance, not categorized as a motor, even though it may have a motorized component in it. It is not, so it's just an appliance, standardized unit, utilization equipment, and that is 7.5 amperes at 120. And of course, again, y'all know how to convert that, and we will later convert that to VA, amps times the volts. We have 3 attic fans, and those are 4.2 amperes each. So we have 3 of them up there in the attic. So we just added the sum together, 12.6 amps. And again, to get the total VA, amps times volts. And we're going to do that as we move through this. It's going to go quickly once we start working through the form. The next is we gathered a clothes dryer. Now this one happens to have a nameplate on it that is 5.5 kW. And you're going to see that when you're doing the standard, that nameplate rating of 5.5 is what you would use in the optional method. You just simply use the nameplate. In fact, that's what makes the optional method easy because you just pull everything from the nameplate. In the standard method, it is 5,000 or the nameplate, okay? Whichever is, okay? So yes, so Richard, the garage is, we have a question here. And in the 2023 edition of the NEC, it most certainly will be included in that 3 VA per square foot, not 3% per square foot, 3 VA per square foot, because they removed the language, right? They used to have garage in there to where you would exclude it, and now garage is missing from that, okay? There's a reason they removed garage from it, that type of scenario. Back to last couple places here that I went to in Texas, they took their garage and they actually converted it into a mother-in-law suite, which is kind of neat. It was a garage, but they changed the garage door and put across it. They framed it in and created a separate entry into it. Quite interesting, but it was most certainly ability to expand it to a habitable use. And it was expandable as future use. So that's why we take it into consideration, and that's why the garage was taken out. Whereas now it just talks about the application of spaces that are not adaptable for future use and open porches. Okay, so yep, absolutely, it's included now in the 2023 edition. Let's see what else. Let's get through these real quick. Counter-mounted cooking unit is 7 kW. Let's see here. That is 7 kW at 240 volts. And remember, it does have a neutral contribution. We'll look at that at some point. Then we have a wall-mounted oven, 6 kW at 240 volts. No self-promotion of YouTube channels or we will ban you. Okay, don't do that. Let's see here. The next is electric heat. 3 banks at 5 kW each. So we're just taking the summation of them. And so that is 5, 10, 15. So that's 15 kW, 240 volts. And to remind you, that is not going to have any neutral contribution because that is electric heat. So we'll look at that when we do the neutral. The next we have is an air handler. That air handler will definitely be blowing the heat around as well. So remember that air handler at 3.2 amperes. Again, we're going to have to convert that to VA. Again, amps times volts. It is not a non-coincident load. So what that means is that when the air conditioning is running, the air handler works. When the heat is running, the air handler works. So that's not going to be a non-coincident load. Whereas typically when the electric heat, central heating is going, the thermostatic control will isolate out the air conditioning. So it won't run, and vice versa. So those would be kind of the non-coincident load. That type of scenario. No worries, Titan. No worries. I'm just making sure that others don't, do that. All right, so that is, and then we have a condenser fan, which is 2 amps at 115 volts each. Okay, so what I will tell you up front before we get away from this and we start working through our form and everything, you'll notice that the items on here that are 120 or that are 115 are going to be part of our neutral load as well. Also, the 3 VA per square foot values are also going to be part of our neutral contribution as well. All right? So it's only the 240 volt loads, except for the range and the dryer, which obviously you electricians are familiar with that, right? We're going to run 4 conductors to those, and they have some elements in there that are going to need 120 volts, right? So definitely we're going to have some neutral loads associated with the dryers and the ranges. So we will take care of that as we move through it. But just so you know up front, they're going to be at 70%. And we get that allowance in 220.61b. So anyway, we'll kind of work through those type of things. All right. So what do we do first? Okay. Now, in the 2020 edition of the NEC, right, we're going to go to 220.14j. And there's a reason I did it this way, since I said I was going to be focused on 2023, because I do up front want to show you the change for the 2023, because I do realize there were people that will be transitioning, right? So that's why I wanted to do this. So if you're in the 2020, you're going to get the 3 VA per square foot information from 220.14j. So let's kind of shift real quick to the NEC so that I can show you that. So in the 2023 edition, oh, by the way, right here under 220.5 is where you get your floor area. Now, this is new for the 2023, okay? And so this shows you that the floor area for each floor shall be calculated by the outside dimensions of the building. So that's why in exam, they're gonna have to give you these dimensions. And in our case, we gave you the dimensions, 35 by 55, right? That's the outside dimensions. You need that. If you're doing this in the real world, you've got to come up with these dimensions. And it's not necessarily the square footage, okay? You have to look at the outside dimensions of the actual dwelling or building in question, right? Then it says, for dwelling units, the calculated floor area shall not include, now check this out, shall not include open porches or unfinished areas not adaptable for future use as a habitable room or occupiable space. Well, a garage is adaptable. And in the previous edition, garage appeared in here. So you omitted it up front, right? That's changed for the 2023, okay? All right, now, so back what we were looking at. So 220.14, if you look down here, you see that no longer is it telling you about the 3 VA per square foot. What's up, Daryl? Thanks for joining me. Also, I just do some shout outs. Richard, thanks for joining me. Logical, thanks for joining me. Let's see, James, I see you. Simplex is in the house. James, one of our fast track students. Daryl is as well. Richard was as well. So thank you all for joining me. This should be old hat for you folks. All right. So now, if we're looking here, so what has changed? Where do we get the 3 VA per square foot now in the 2023 edition? Well, we got to scroll down a little bit, and we're going to go down here, and we're going to get to, bear with me here. I think I went too far. Hold on. Got popped a little too far. I'm scrolling through this thing, and it's just rolling along. Okay, right here. Okay, so 220.41, which used to be, now it's kind of easy to remember this one, right? 220.14, just reverse it. So 220.14 and spin the 14 around to 41. Hey, whatever helps you remember things. But in the 2023 edition, you can see that the 3 VA is now under 220.41. So there's a code change for you. If you're in the 2020, it's 14J. If you're in the 2023, it's now 220.41. Now, interesting, when it comes to that 3 VA per square foot, what does it cover? Well, it's pretty clear down here that it says that unit loads include the following lighting and receptacle outlets, and no additional load calculation shall be required. So all of your general use receptacle outlets of 20 amperes or less, including receptacles connected for the circuits specified in 210.11C3, the bathrooms, and C4, the garages. So no additional value needs to be, so that's where we asked that question. I'm not sure who asked the question. I think it was Richard who posted it. So this is where you know that that 3 VA is covering those as well. Okay, so that's not the same as the required at least one 20 amp branch circuit to the bathroom. We're talking about a load calc here. And so we don't have to account for any additional VA for that garage. We don't have to count any additional VA for that bathroom. But this also brings me to a question people ask about an unfinished basement. And that is one of our questions that we have on our Fast Tracks program, which says that if you account for the unfinished basement, that very much is factored into the 3 VA per square foot. So if a customer ultimately wants to add some additional receptacle outlets in a basement, that's not going to increase the service load. That's not going to, we don't have to refigure that, because that square footage needs to be included in your original 3 VA per square foot, right? And so that's going to be covered in the 3 VA per square foot. And that's the general use things. But remember, it's not talking about the small appliances. That's a separate VA that's got to be accounted for, 1,500 VA each. The laundry, it has to also be accounted for. So that's not talking about those things, okay? It also lets you know that the receptacles outlets specified in 210.52E are also already figured into this. Outdoor receptacles at the front and the back of the dwelling, all those things are already figured into the 3 VA per square foot. And then here, the lighting. All of your lighting that you're putting in, unless it's some kind of specialty lighting, is already figured in to the 3 VA per square foot. All of those that are listed under 210.70. The illumination rules. All of that is already included, so you don't have to do anything extra. Okay? But my main point here is to show you that there was this slight change. Okay? But the rules didn't change. So it's simply the same as it was before, but I wanted to show you the NEC. Okay, mission accomplished on that. So 3 VA per square foot. So outside dimensions, it is, as you see here, it is 35 by 55. And of course, we have that open porch area, which is 7 by 10. We need to take that away because you saw what it said, that we don't include that area. All right, and 220.5C says we don't include that area. All right, so 7 by 10 is 70, and 35 by 55 is 1,925 square feet. We're going to take away 70, and that gives us 1,855. Okay, remember, we took away the open porch. And again, at 3 VA per square foot, we multiply the 1,855 times 3. That is 5,565. Now, you guys have heard me say this over and over again. Do not trust my math. The only way you get better at the NEC is to make sure you have your calculator and work it out. So I'm working it out right here with you. So I'm going to put this down, and I've already calculated 3 times the 1855. And so my total should be 565. Okay. So I am going to test that out. You can do it yourself, but I'm going to make sure that I'm right. 1855 times 3 is 5,565. So I feel good. I filled out my form. That's box 1 for you that follow along in the Fast Tracks program. If you printed out these little templates for you, these little formula sheets or calculation sheets, it's great to have them. All right, so that's our first step. Okay, so we've knocked this part of it out of the way. This part right here. Now let's move on to these small appliance circuits. Now, y'all all are very aware that the code states that you have to have at least a minimum of 2. Now, if I'm on an exam and they're asking me and they're giving me all this information to do a load calculation for a dwelling, if you in that rare exam that asks you to do all that, because most of the time they won't, it'll just be little pieces they ask you. But if you happen to be on an exam, like maybe in North Carolina or somewhere where they actually give you all this info that you need to do a load calculation, and they don't tell you to use the optional, so you know you got to use standard. Well, you know that if they don't tell you how many small appliance branch circuits that are in there, then you just have to assume there's a minimum of 2, right? In our case, we're told that it's 4, so easy for us. So in your code book, you'll see that in 220.52a, and we'll go look at that in the code book, just so we can see that, 220.52, just to see it. Right here. So here's your small appliance and laundry. Easy to remember. They're in the same location. And here's where it tells you that each dwelling unit, the load shall be calculated at 1500 VA for each 2-wire small appliance branch circuit covered in 210.11c1, and 210.11c1 required a minimum of 2. Of course, we got 4, but the minimum was 2. Okay. And then, of course, down here is for the laundry. And again, 1500 VA for each 2-wire laundry. The code in 210.11c2 requires at least 1, but our dwelling that we're calculating has how many? 2. That is so important too, because if you are calculating out for somebody in the real world, you ought to know. For example, when I'm doing this 10,000 square foot calculation for the house that my brother's wiring back in Virginia, I know that they're going to have more than 2. So I have to look at it and say, well, it looks to me like we're going to have at least 5. So I have to take that as 1500 VA each for 5 of them, that type of thing. Okay. So, and then when I'm calculating, I might do it at 6 after I've done everything and see if that's going to change my load any, or it's going to make my service change. Just so I know that I have that flexibility. If I'm wiring it, I decide I want to put 1 more in there, that type of thing. Okay. Makes sense? So I'm always thinking about that in the real world. Exam, it's pretty simple. They got to give you the values to take into consideration, right? Okay. All right, so here we go. We've got 1500 VA each, and we know we've got 4 of them, so it's pretty simple. We're going to do 4 times 1500, and that's going to give me 6,000. So on my form down here, I'm going to say that I have 4 of them. So 1500 times 4 is 6,000. So on my form, we just do it. Now, I do have students and people that watch my videos that'll ask, where do I get these forms? They're on the internet. You can Google them. There's different people that have different forms. Ours you can't get unless you're in our program. So don't even ask. Okay. So you have to be a member to get access to these. All right. But there's tons of available ones out on the internet. Just Google for it. Single family dwelling load calculation form, and I'm sure you'll find one. All right, so I've written that down. Next, laundry circuit. 220.52b told us that it was 1500 VA for each 2-wire laundry circuit. Okay, 2-wire being hot and neutral. Okay, all right, and we had 2 of them. All right, so pretty straightforward. 2 times 1500 is 3,000. So I'm going to write that down. So I've got 2 of them, and then I'm going to put down 3,000. pretty straightforward on our form. I know y'all can't see that, but I just wanted you to see kind of that we're kind of working through the form, okay? Now, the reason for this also in the form is it also gives you code references. So at any time you're stuck or for some reason, you can always just look at the code references and send you where. I also should remind you, if you're in the middle of an exam and you get stumped on anything, if you go to the informative Annex D of the NEC, it will also give you some examples of a single family dwelling calculation, okay? So it gets you back on track, okay? That type of scenario, okay? All right, so also should remind folks, we have a good question that did come up here that says if you have a stack unit, okay, remember, dryers are not required. The laundry circuit is required, okay? So you're still required to have the laundry circuit at 20 ampere circuit regardless. That is still required. There is nothing in the NEC that requires a dryer circuit, okay, a 30 amp dryer circuit. Now, obviously, if you're on an exam, right, and they give you a dryer, then you have to take that into consideration because they gave you the value. In fact, we do today on ours. But you're not required to put a dryer in. You're not required to calculate for a dryer unless, of course, it's being used. And if it is, then you have to apply it. Ironically, that's the same thing for cooking. I don't know if you knew that or not. I mean, I could have gas cooking and have no loads when it comes to cooking. I'm not forced to put a value in for cooking. So that's the same thing for the dryer, that type of scenario. Okay. Now, if I do have the dryer circuit that's being installed and it's a 30 amp, then I have to take consideration for that. Okay. Hopefully that answered your question. All right. All right. So we've got our value. I've already written it all down, so we're good to go there. Okay. So what we have so far is our three values that should match what you have on your form here. I've got 5,565 VA for the general lighting and general load. I've got 6,000 for the small appliance, and I got 3,000 for the laundry, okay, in the dwelling that we're working on. Now, before we can apply any demand factors, we need to know how they are applied. So under part 3, which is we refer to as the standard method, it really doesn't call it that in the NEC, right? It's just the method, and it's part 3. Whereas part 4 is optional method. So in order to differentiate the two, we just call it standard method. But really it's part 3 method. And then of course you have part 4, which is the optional method, right? So remember on an exam, unless they tell you to use the optional, then you have to go with the normal method, which is part 3. And we refer to that as the standard method. Okay, you get me? Okay. All right, so there's the values. Now, if you're looking in part 3, then the standard method, again, it is going to be, we're going to now apply some adjustments, okay? Some demands that we get to apply to this thing, all right? So 220.45, and we get the permission to do all this and have the general lighting also include those general use receptacles. They're included in this demand that we're going to go. Even though the table, which is 220.45 under the 2023 NEC, even though that table just says general lighting, you know that the general use receptacles are included, 20 amps or less, are included in that because we saw earlier when we looked at the code that it specifically said that that was included in 220.41, right? So we know that's included in that, okay? So we're down to that. So that's where we're at. So now we're going to have to apply those things, okay? Let's see here. Question we had from the thing is, should the laundry room circuit always be counted regardless if it's being used or not? If it's you have to have a laundry circuit, period. Unless you're dealing with a multifamily dwelling that has a laundry facility on site, that is available to all of the tenants or all of the renters or whatever, then it doesn't matter whether you use that laundry room or not. You have to have at least one 20 amp laundry circuit. Okay? Got to have at least one. Now, whether you use it or not, it's totally up to you. But you have to have the laundry circuit in using the standard method for that calculation. Okay? All right? Because the code tells me I do. Now, again, if it's a multifamily building that has a laundry facility on site, then you have some allowances to be able to not put the laundry receptacle in because it's available to all the tenants or all the people that are at the complex, and there's a separate laundry facility. Then that's different. Then you don't have to install the receptacle at all, but you're required to have the laundry circuit. And in a single family dwelling, you're required to install the laundry receptacle outlet. Okay? And I believe that is in 220.52D, if I'm not mistaken. All right? Okay. Let's kind of go over a little bit more. But thank you for the question. Again, y'all can post your questions. I will try to answer them as we go. All right. So first thing we're going to do is now we're going to bring all of that stuff together. And we're going to apply some math because now I'm going to work out some demand. Now on our form, we have an area which is labeled item number 4, and we have to add all these values up. So that's what we're going to do here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take that 5565, we're going to add the 6,000 to it, and we're going to add the 3,000 to it. So it should be 14,565. But again, I never trust the math. So 5,565 plus 6,000 plus 3,000. And that is 14,565. So that part was correct. So I'm going to transfer that down to box number 4 in my little formula here, or my little calculation thing. So I'm going to do 14,565. Okay. So now I'm going to get to apply some demands here. Okay. So now what does it say in the code? So let's go back really quickly to the NEC. And see, well, I don't have to go back to the NEC. It's right here on the screen for you. So this is what it looks like in the 2023 edition. And this is the table 220.42 is what it is in the 2020 edition. So you get to see both here. Nothing changed. It's nothing you got to learn different. It's just moved a little bit. And so here you see it says the first 3,000 at 100%. So we know that of that 14,565, at least 3,000 of it is 100%. So we're going to take that 3,000, we're going to set it aside, right? Now, from 3,001 up to 120,000, which our dwelling falls well below that, so it falls right in there, we're going to take that remainder at 35%, okay? Now, if you were doing this massive house and then you had any additional VA that was over 120, then you're able to reduce that by 25%. So you stack effect it, and it's really going to give you a good demand factor for this for these dwellings, right? But in our case, we only have the first 3,000 at 100, and then the next up to next to 117,000, or the next from 3,001 up to 120,000. We're going to fall in the 35% factor. Okay, so here's how we kind of do the math. We take that 14,565. Let's take that 3 away and set it aside right now. So in our form, we're going to take the info from line 4 and we're going to put it down in line 5, which is 14,565. So you can't really see it on here, but that's kind of how we're doing it. Okay, just following along. So we take that 3,000 away and that gives us 11,565. Okay, so that's what you would have in column 5 of the form if you're using our form. So it'd be 11,565. Okay, now, at that point, that 11,565, that is nowhere near exceeding the next 117,000. So we know that the multiplier for us is going to be 35%. We're nowhere near it. Okay, so we take that 11,565 and we multiply it by 35%. So we're going to do that. And on our form, we're simply going to move that down to box 8. So I'm going to take that 11,565, drop it down to box 8, and all we're going to do is 11,565 times 0.35 And what do we get? We get 4,047.75, which I'm going to round. Remember, the rules in 220.5 allows me to round up 0.5 or greater when we're dealing with it. So I'm going to go on and round it up. Now, if you want to keep the full amount and carry it on until the end, that's up to you. It's not going to change anything, okay? But we're going to round this up to 7,048, okay? So I'm going to make sure I write that down right here, okay? No, excuse me, that was 4,048, excuse me. So I'm at 4,048, okay? So that's what you'd get in box 8, okay? So basically 4,048 is the 35% of 11,565. Now, on our form, what we do is we remind you that, guess what? Remember that first 3,000 at 100%? Well, I got to bring it back because that was at 100%. There was no demand factor for that first 3,000. It's 100%. So now I'm going to add that back to the 4,048, and we do that on our form. You just simply take it and pop it in where it says line 8. And you're on column 9, you're going to put it in line 8. So I'm going to do the 4,048. You add those two up, and it's 7,048 VA. Now, that's what it looks like on our form. Hard for you to see it, I'm sure, but that's what it looks like. Now, here's the first thing I'm going to remind you in this process. That is also neutral loads. We get to apply the same demands that we just did for the neutral as we're doing for the hot. So I recommend you, when you're doing a calculation to save you some time, although we're going to do the neutral quickly at the end here, just write it out in the column beside it, this open column. Keep track of your neutrals out here. So out here, I'm going to put a big N on the right side of my form, and I'm going to write that out here to the side. I'm going to write 7,048 because that is also, all of those loads we just talked about are all neutral loads, right? So that's most certainly going to be used in our calculation for the neutral. So I'm just saving me some time, that's all. All right, so there we go. So now we get back and I say, what have we knocked out? We've knocked out all of this here. We've knocked out all of that. So now what are we going to be focusing on? Appliances. All right. So now let's talk about appliances. So now one of the things that these appliances are, it's utilization equipment that is fastened in place, okay? We're not talking about stuff that is not fastened in place. We're talking about things that are fastened in place. Dishwashers, okay? Typically, whether they're quarter plug or hardwired, have mounting screws underneath the front for anti-tip. You're going to put it in place. It is fixed in place. A garbage in-sink waste disposer gets connected, whether it's cord and plug or hardwired, it gets connected to the plumbing system. It's fixed in place, okay? Trash compactors are simply put in. Most of the time, those are hardwired, but even if it was cord and plug, it is typically, so they don't move, you fasten them in place, okay? All those fastened in place type appliances. These attic fans, they're fastened in place type of appliances, utilization equipment. Okay? So kind of remember all those type of things when we're looking at the different types of appliances. Now, interesting question that people raise, and we'll go look at the code. In the 2023 edition of the NEC, people ask me all the time, is an EV charger an appliance? Well, yes, it's an appliance. It's made in standardized sizes, but specifically, when we're looking at appliances in 220.53 for the 2023 edition of the NEC, it specifically excludes EV charging systems from being considered an appliance in order to be able to be a part of this reduction that you get when you have 4 or more fastened in place appliances, okay? So people ask me that question all the time. Now, under the 2023 edition of the NEC, it doesn't have EV in the list in 220.53. So some people will argue that I can treat that as an appliance in order to have it count as part of my 4 or more appliances that are fastened in place. You need to work that out with your local AHJ, but I can tell you the intent was for it not to be. But as everybody says, if it's not in the code and it's not prohibiting you from doing it, then a good argument could be made that you can use that in your count of fastened in place appliances. Under the 2023, it is very clear that you can't. Okay. Also, under the 2023 edition of the NEC, you now have a VA value that you must take into consideration if you have EV chargers. Obviously, that doesn't come into play if you have no EV chargers. But if you do, we now have a minimum VA value, or the nameplate, whichever is greater, that you would just simply add to your load. It wouldn't go under the appliances, but at the end, it's just another thing that's an other load that you would add in. So don't overcomplicate it. You got to account for it. It's a load, so you just add it in. And it tells you now in the NEC what that VA is to account for that. Okay, pretty straightforward. I look really pale in the camera, don't I? I'm only using one studio light today, so it gets hot in here when I use more than one. So not that you care, but figured I'd tell you why. I look kind of pale. All right. So let's go look and see what we got. Okay, now the first thing that we also want to remember that typically in residential calculations like this, that anything with a HP or horsepower rating is a motor. But a trash compactor, dishwasher, things like that, we're not consider those as the motors. And that's important later when we're looking for the largest motor in the dwelling. Okay, so that type of thing. So we want to make sure that you understand that when you go looking for the largest motor later, right, that you definitely want to make sure that you're looking for a true motor, that type of scenario. One of the questions that just came in, and Daryl, thank you for caring. I know you guys do. Many of you do. So Richard says, well, what about exhaust fans? Interesting. So let's look at the 2020 edition of the NEC real quick, and we'll go look at those appliances. So here's the appliance, and you see in the 2023 that it no longer, again, does not apply to these following. So again, the EV chargers cannot be in this mix. But here's the deal. That 75% demand when you have 4 or more is going to be based on this. It says 4 or more appliances rated a 4th horsepower or greater, or 500 watts or greater. Chances are those exhaust fan motors that are in your bathroom are not rated a 4th horsepower or greater. They're probably much less than that. Okay, 1/16 horsepower or smaller, or they're not going to be 500 watts or greater. So that's your threshold, okay, to make sure. So no. Now, years ago, there was a problem before this language made it in the 2020, there were people that were stacking using these little motors in order to try to bump them into being able to have 4 or more. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know why they would do that, because nobody's going to be, in the real world, nobody's going to be using the standard method to size their service anyway for a dwelling. They're going to be using the optional. Okay, so, but anyway, there you go. So hopefully that makes sense. So yes, you're not going to include those exhaust fans. They are entirely too small for that application. But thank you for bringing that up. All right, now, other the things you also have to remember that as we're in the process, we're going to have to get the horsepower for the specific motors that we do have in play. So I think we have an in-sync waste disposer, and we're going to have to go get the FLC for that. And then once we have the amps, we're going to multiply that by the voltage in order to get our VA. But also think you remember that we have other appliances that are going to require us to do a little calculation as well in order to get our VA. And by the way, this is a good opportunity for me to remind you that over in Fast Tracks Tube we do have Ohm's Law videos, and we do have series and parallel circuit videos. So for those that say your course doesn't go deep into series and parallels, or it doesn't go deep into Ohm's Law, we have videos over on Fast Tracks Tube for that. Okay, because it's assumed that when you're entering into an exam prep program that you've got the hours in and the time in that you don't need for us to go over the basics of Ohm's Law, Watt's Law, and things like series and parallels. but I do understand that some people do need that additional information, and some exams do have some theory stuff. So if you are an enhanced student or you're in the plus program, utilize the Fast Tracks too, because we do have videos over there that will give you some additional enhancements when it comes to that, okay? And if you wait around, you'll actually see that we have a coupon, so you can get 50% off an annual subscription to Fast Tracks Tube if you're interested, okay? So just hang around for that if you're into that type of thing. All right, so another important thing I want to remind you, when we look at these appliances, if you're doing a load calculation on an exam or even in the real world, and you've only got 1, 2, or 3 appliances, then you do not get to apply any demands. You don't get to take advantage of 220.53. You just take those appliances at their full VA value, and you simply just have to add them to your calculation. You don't get to reduce them in any way, okay? So the demands only apply. And this is what makes it easy to explain this to people. They say, well, what if I have this? Or what if I have another appliance? Or what if I have that? Well, if you're going to add them to your load calculation, maybe they fall under the fastened in place appliances. But if they don't fall under this, then how do you add them? You basically just add them. That's it. You just may not get a demand factor for them. Okay? That's the thing about the optional method. When you have other appliances, boy, you're just taking the nameplate and you're just adding them up, adding them up, adding them up, right? So that's why the optional tends to be easier than the standard. Just kind of keeping those things in mind that we don't want to make it complicated, but those are little things that you do need to think about. Okay, now, if it's a service or feeder and it's being calculated and it contains at least 4 fastened in place appliances, okay? So a microwave that goes on the counter that plugs into a receptacle is not a fastened in place appliance. It's not, okay? All right, so let's look at it. So if it is fastened in place, then we get to apply a 75% demand to that, okay? All right, remember, how do we get the VA? Voltage, you multiply voltage by the amps. You should know that by now, but I just want to make sure that's clear. All right, so here's what we go. Here's what we're working on. You remember? And I've done the math for you. But I would say at this time, a lot of times on my videos, I say you can pause and work these out. But for the webinar, I wanted to go on and do it. So we've already done it. All right. So here's your water heater, 4.5 kW. Y'all all know that kW is equivalent to kVA. I like to work things in VA because that's typically how we work things when we're doing a load calc. But essentially, the code tells you that they're synonymous. So 4.5 kW is equivalent. So if you see here, I've got 4,500 kW. The reason I put this way is because most students know that in my program, I will mark that wrong. And so that's why I leave some of these things in here for my students so I can elaborate on it. That would not be accurate. That's 4,500 watts, not 4,500 kilowatts. Okay, so I like to leave little things to make you aware of that. So that is right there would be wrong. That would be watts. But in order for you to convert this, you would just take the 4.5 times 1,000, and that's how you get 4,500 watts. Okay, so kind of these little tidbits I like to teach you. Most of my students that are in our programs know this. So again, just kind of shout out to those. So it's 4,500 VA. Now the dishwasher is 10 amperes times 120 volts, okay? Because we already know what the amps are. So this one is easy. 10 times 120 is 1,200 VA, so that's our VA for the dishwasher. In-sink waste disposer, that's a 0.5 horsepower. And it is single phase, and we would need to go where? Remember this. Anytime you get a horsepower rating, even on the exam, the first thing you want to do is you want to go, dude, I need to convert this to VA because I'm going to be working with VA. So you got to find the FLC. The FLC for this one is found in 430.248, okay, because this is single phase. So if you go there and look, you'll see that it's 9.8 amperes. Now, if we do that in the NEC, because I do make sure I don't leave anybody hanging, Anybody that might be new to the code or new to our program or want to see where I go, I'll just show you. You go to 430, which is motors, right? And we're dealing with a motor because it's in horsepower rating. Then I'm going to go down to it, and the tables are at the back. Okay, so when you go down to these tables, and we're dealing with this table here, single phase, alternating current. I'll see if this table will pop up. There you go. So there's a table, and for us, it was, I believe it was a half horsepower. So right here, half, and it is, I believe it was 115. And by the way, I get this a lot too. If it said 120 and we're dealing with the horsepower, it doesn't matter. You still would come to this column because you see the content in here, up here. It says 110 to 120 and also down here from ranges 110 to 120. So basically you're still going to use the 115 column even if it was given to me, for example, for a motor, it was given to me as 120. Now don't get confused if it's for like that dishwasher. That dishwasher, if it had said 10 amps times 115, then you use the 115. You use whatever they give you, okay? In our case, it was 120. But if you get a motor question and they give you 120 or they give you 115, you use what they give you, okay? It's just in our case, since the motor was a 120, we know that most of the motors on the nameplate, it might be 120, but it's going to be rated at 115. So that's why we're using the 115 column, in case anybody ever got confused on that. And the reason, the permission for that is all right here, okay? So in case that ever confuses you, they might say, well, wait a minute, it says the thing it's 120, but why are we using the 115 column? Well, it should be a no-brainer because there's no 120 column, right? Okay. Go without saying. All right, so in our case here, it is 9.8 amperes. That's what we'll be working with, okay? All right, so we see that it's 9.8 amperes, right? And we're going to be multiplying it by 115 because if you see it says it was 115, all right? So we're going to use the 115. So in our case, just double check their math, 9.8 times 115, and that is 1,127, and that's what we're going to use. So the next one's a trash compactor, again, not classified as a motor. It's an appliance. It's utilization equipment, standardization. It might look a little different as far as the code goes. It's a standardized utilization equipment. 7.5 amperes, and since it's in 120, then we're just going to go 7.5 amps times 120, and that should be 90. I'm going to double check. 7.5 times 120 is 900. I don't know if I said 90. 900, that's right. And then we have those 3 attic fans. Might as well bulk them up, summation of them, add them all up together, which is 12.6, which is 4.2 times 3, in case you wonder where I got that at. So same thing here. They're all listed as 120 volt in our exam question, right? So we're going to do these at 12.6. Sorry about that tap in there. Times 120, remember, using what they gave us, and that is 1,512. So we have all of them. Now, the first thing you'll notice is how many appliances do we have? Well, let's add it up first. Let's add all these numbers first before I get into that, okay? Because this is where you can get sometimes tricked up on an exam. So I've got 1,500 plus 1,200 plus 1127 plus 900 plus 1512. And that is 9,239. So that's what we have right here. So now, in the real world, if you didn't want to apply the 75% demand, I don't know why you wouldn't, but if you didn't, then you could use that 9,239. Now, means your service or feeder is going to be larger than it needs to be, right? But I mean, you have that, you can do that if you want. On an exam, it will be expected for you to know the best possible answer. And the best possible answer means to utilize the allowance for the 75%. Why? Because how many appliances do we have? Do we have 5, right? No, we've got more than 5, don't we? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, because we had 3 of those attic fans, okay? Quick click in. So even if we were to forget that, we still had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we still would be able to apply the 75%. Why? Because we have 4 or more fastened in place appliances, okay? So we're going to be able to apply our 75% to this equation. Now, in my little form here, I want to make sure I fill all these out. So I'm going to do 4,500. For the compactor, I'm going to put 900. For the dishwasher, I'm going to put 1,200. You should be doing the same thing if you're using the form. For the disposer, I'm going to be putting 1,127. And so the total, again, was 9,239. Okay, so this is exactly how you would fill it out on your form. I know you can't see it, but that's how we fill all that out. Now, remember, if you only had 3 or 2 or 1, then you're not going to apply any demands. You just put the total amount here, and that's what's going to transfer over to your calculation. But we obviously have 4 or more. So now I'm going to apply the 75% to that. So I take that 9,239 and I multiply that by 75%, or 0.75 if you're using a calculator and you don't want to use percentages, then you can use it. Now, how do we convert these into decimals? You start from the right and move 2 decimal spaces to the left, so that 75 becomes 0.75, okay? Just a little lesson. Also have a video on converting and working on what we call basic math is available also over on Fast Tracks Tube, so make sure you check that out. All right, so I'm going to do 9,239 times 0.75, and that's going to give me 6,929.25. So I'm going to drop that 0.25, and you could leave it if you want, but I'm going to drop it, and that's 6,929. And so that is what's going to be our new appliance application. So that's 6,929. Okay? Now, you might say, let's move on to the dryer. But remember, what we're doing while we're going down this list, we're working on that neutral at the same time. I love to work at the same time. So when you look at these loads here, notice something. There is only one of them here that utilizes no neutral. That is the water heater. Water heaters do not use a neutral. Okay, it's just a heating element. All right, doesn't have a neutral element to this. All right, so and we're not talking about a hot water heater that's gas that has a blower. Okay, that's typically would be just a 15 amp branch circuit to a receptacle. It doesn't typically even have to be dedicated. Okay, so it might be one of those receptacles that are down there for the 3 VA square foot. It might be just a general use receptacle you plug into. Got to look at the instructions from the manufacturer to see whether they call out something dedicated or not. But we're concerned more about the fact that that water heater is 240 volt, and we're doing a neutral calc while we're doing this. So I'm going to say, you know what? Do I still have 4 or more appliances, even if I take out that water heater, that are neutral loads? Absolutely, I do. I've got this dishwasher. That's a neutral load. I got this in-sink waste disposer. That's a neutral load. Trash compactor is going to have a neutral load because it's 120. And then we have all of those attic fans. They also are 120. So what have I got? I've got 3, 4, 5, 6 that are, so I've got 4 or more. So guess what? This is where people get confused about the neutral. If I could apply this demand factor to the hot conductors, why can't I apply it to the neutral? And the answer is you can. So we're going to do the same thing. But in this case, I'm going to add up everything except for this 4,500. Now, since we've already done this math right here, I'm just going to take that 9,239 and I'm going to subtract 4,500 from it. So 9,239 minus 4,500, and that gives me 4,739. I'm going to take that number, I'm going to multiply that by 75%, right? Because we do have 4 more appliances. And if it was okay to do it for the hots, why can't we do it for the neutral? Many people miss that. So I want to make sure we do it. So I'm taking that 4,739 times 0.75, and that gives me 3,554 0.25 amps. Okay, now, a lot of times I teach students to, when it comes to the neutral, put the full amount. I mean, put 3554.25. Now, the only reason I really do that when we're teaching you is because you could get an exam question that says, what is the neutral contribution? And that's typically a branch circuit type question. And all they're asking you is, you know what is the actual neutral contribution? And so it's easy for me to teach students to just take that value at whatever you get in the calculator, that's your neutral contribution. No rounding, that is just it. Because if I round it up, then that's not the true neutral contribution. If I round it down, that's not the true neutral contribution. However, when we're doing a service load calculation, I feel it is perfectly okay for you to drop off the 0.25 if you would like, and just use 3,554, okay? So anyway, that's what we have. So out here on the side, whichever you choose to use, we're going to do that. And so out here to the side, I'm going to write my neutral load, and I'm going to write 3,554.25, and then underneath it in a little parentheses, I'm going to go 3,554, okay? Just so I kind of know what I got going on. Now, the reason I do that is because when I'm looking at the answer in the exam, in the end, and you've got 4 different options, A, B, C, or D, I want to quickly be able to see whether or not the mindset of whoever wrote that question. Because you can't guarantee how they're writing it or whether or not they believe in the rounding or they believe in the full value. But also, it allows me to make sure that you learn that if I ask you a question about the actual neutral contribution for any specific circuit, that you know what I'm asking you for, okay? It's not going to make a difference in the load calc, though, and you'll see. All right, so there we go. So that goes out to the side, and I'll show you what that looks like. Again, there you go. You see it out in the side, so that's my neutral. Already taken care of. Let's move on. All right, next, let's tackle the dryer. This is easy peasy, okay? So if you go look in the NEC, now, I want to remind you, you are not required to add a dryer circuit in a dwelling. I know that kind of, that might blow people's minds. They're like, well, every house I've ever done has a dryer. Yeah, and you're going to account for it if it has a dryer. But there's absolutely nothing that requires it. And the reason I bring this up is to say that I was writing an exam question, and I gave you the question, and I wanted you to do the sizing for a single-family dwelling, and I did not tell you there was a dryer. There are a lot of people that are going to add 5,000 VA for a dryer, and that would be wrong because nothing in the code requires a dryer circuit. It will require a laundry circuit, but not a dryer circuit. However, if the exam mentions a dryer, you have to take it into consideration. If I'm wiring a building and it has a dryer and for a laundry room, then I have to add it in there because it's there, right? But interesting enough, the NEC does not demand you add it, okay? All right, so in our case, we did have a dryer, and it was 5.5 kW or 5,500 watts or 5.5 kVA, however your flavor. All right. Now, what does it say in the NEC under Article 220.54? Well, we can go look at it. And I'll take us back to 220.54. Bear with me. Right here. All right. So what you see here, it says the load for a household electric clothes dryer in a dwelling unit shall be either 5,000 watts. And remember, watts is synonymous with VA, volt amperes, or the nameplate rating, whichever is larger, okay, for each dryer to be served, okay? So in a dwelling, unless you've got some mega mansion, if you have 1 to 4 dryers, they're just at 100%. So you would take the nameplate or 5,000 for each dryer, whichever is larger. Okay, whether it's the nameplate or the dryer. Now, in our case, the dryer's nameplate is larger. It's 5.4 kW. So obviously, we're going to use that in our equation. We're not going to be using the 5,000, but that is where you get it, okay? 220.54. Do you kind of see how, when you're looking at the NEC, it's kind of stacking? If you know how to, and I have students that will actually take this form, and then when you can write in your code book, depending on what state you're in, they will actually put the different steps and write it next to the different code articles so that it kind of reminds them of the step process. You have to know whether or not your state allows this or not. Not all states let you write in your code book, but if you're already taking your exam and you're a licensed electrician already, then again, you need to do these calcs. Then you can most certainly write in your code book. That's your prerogative to do so. I got notes and stuff written all in mine. Okay, that type of thing. So anyway, okay, so we know that we're going to be using that 5,500, so that's an easy one. So on our form, when it comes to clothes dryer, which is item number 11, we're simply going to put down 5,500. Now, remember what we said about the neutral? Because we're here, might as well tackle it. The National Electrical Code allows me, under 220.61b, to take the load that we just figured, which was 5,500, and I can take that at 70% to determine my neutral load. Now you say, well, where does it say that? Okay, well, let's go to the code, and I'm going to show you in 220.61b. So here we're dealing with the feeder or service neutral load, right? Here's B, permitted reductions. And here you see here for the dryer, here you see for ranges, wall-mounted ovens, counter-mounted cooking. It says, again, up at the beginning right here, it says a service or feeder supplying the following loads shall be permitted to have an additional demand factor of 70% applied to the amount in 220.61b1 and a portion of the amount in 220.61b2. So we're going to be using B1, and B1 is saying, okay, well, this applies to your dryers, and you'll see in a minute that also applies to our cooking. Makes sense? So we're able to do this. So while we're here, we're going to knock out the neutral. Why not get it out of the way since we're here? So I'm going to take that 5,500, and I'm going to multiply that by 70%, or 0.70. If we convert it to a decimal, always easier to convert to decimal, 0.70. So times 0.70, and that equals 3,850. That's my neutral portion for this clothes dryer. So I'm going to write that down so that I've got it. So it's 3,850. Okay, easy peasy. Okay, so we've got 5,500 for our ungrounded conductor and our load calc. And as you can see, I got 3,850 for the neutral for that. Okay. So the next thing we're going to be tackling is the cooking. And I have some very good videos over on Fast Tracks Tube when it comes to cooking. There's a 2-part series. I think it's the best videos out there. I'm biased, of course, but I think it's the best videos out there that really breaks down. I don't know if any of you out there have seen it or watched it. Your comments, I'm more than happy to take your comments on it. But I break down not only the branch circuit application for ranges, but in one part, the first part, I actually break down the loading and how to deal when you have ranges of different sizes, how to use the different columns and all that, column A, column B, column C in 220.55. It's a great detailed video. So I encourage you to go watch that over on fasttrackstube.com. If you haven't watched it yet, it's a must watch. Okay. All right, so let's go on and break these down. So we have household cooking appliances. One thing to remember, if there is no cooking appliances rated over 1 3/4, then there is no need to add anything in the calculation. Okay. So, if it's 1 3/4, if it's less than 1 3/4, then you're just basically taking it at its value. Okay. Whatever it is. You just don't get to apply any demands to it. All we're talking about is, can we apply any demands? Okay. But in our case, all of ours are over 1 3/4. Okay. So we're going to be able to apply some demands here. Okay. So if your individual appliance is rated more than 1 3/4 or 1,750 VA or watts, you can apply the demand factors and you get to utilize table 220.55, right? So now, I'll remind you that once we do this, the neutral load also is the same as we just did for the dryer, 70%. Okay, so makes it easy, right, to do the neutral. That's why I like to do it as we go. All right, so let's look at what we got going on here. So we've got a 7 kW counter-mounted cooking unit, cooktop. It's kind of a big cooktop. And there are definitely, as Richard says, again, there are a bunch of notes in there which you will learn about over in our range videos, that type of thing, right? Those are definitely where you would find those. So remember, you've got notes to be aware of, okay? All right, so we're looking right here, and let's see what we've got. And we're going to kind of look at that table here in a second. We've got a 7 kW counter-mounted cooking unit, which is cooktop, and we have a 6 kW wall-mounted oven. Kind of weird to have the cooktop greater than the oven, but it is what it is in our question. So you'll notice that something interesting here when it comes to the ranges or the cooking appliances here. Both of these fall under column B of 220.55. Both of them do, right? So it falls between 3.5 and not more than 8 3/4. Both of these fall right in column B. Now, interesting language about the note, because what we're going to be using is note 3. And it tells us that in lieu of the normal use of column C, which you use in most all occasions, and you use the other notes like note 1 and note 2 when we're exceeding 12 kW ranges. But in our case, we're going to be using the in lieu of language and comparing it to column C. And whichever one yields the best result, that's what we're going to use, right? So what we want to do really quickly is, since we know our values and where they fall, it's going to go to the NEC. And we're going to go to the table right here. And I'm going to see if I can blow this thing up, how much you can see of it. You can see all but the third one, so that's okay for right now. Okay, the first thing I want to point out is this language. Notice right here. So whether you're using note 1, note 2, or others, you're going to always be using column C. Now, the difference between column A, B, and C is column C is an actual demand value, whereas column A and B are actual percentages. Okay? So that's the first thing to get locked into your mind. And that'll help you because you see this right here, this percentage. But a lot of people get confused when they see these. This is not demand values. These aren't KW values, okay? These are percentages. I know some students that will go ahead and put a little dot beside all of these because, again, converting these to decimals, you start from the right and move 2 spaces to the left, right? Again, don't do that if you're in a state where you're taking an exam and they don't let you write in the code book, okay? But if you are, you can write them in there. You can highlight the percentage here. You can put a big percentage symbol right here. Anything that reminds you of that, okay? The difference. Whereas column C, and I'll show it real quick, column C, just bring it back up. Column C is an actual demand value. So this is not a percentage column. This is actual demands, okay? And remember, it's for not over 12 kW, right? So if I have 11 kW range, for example, then the value we'd use in my load calc is simply 8 kW. If it's a 12 kW range, we would use 8 kW. If it's an 8 kW range, we'd use 8 kW, okay? If we're using column C. But if it's an 8 kW, actual 8 kW range, then you would go over here and compare it to column B, because that means that the 8 kW range would fall between 3.5 and 8 3/4. See how that works? But if it was 9 kW, then on your calculation, you just use 8. You see how that works? It is only until you get over 12, then you have to start using the various notes that are down underneath this table. And those notes are not informational notes. They are actual notes that are very applicable to your calculation, okay? All right, so now for us, since we're going to be able to use column B, because ours is both a 7 and a 6, so it falls nice and nifty between these two values, we're going to use this rule and says that we can use note 3. And the reason for that is if you come down here and look, it'll say for note 3, it says if it's over 1 3/4 through 8 3/4 kW, it says in lieu of the method provided in column C. So that confuses people, but that's what in lieu of means. It means, you know what, if you want to use column C, go for it, but in lieu of that, we'll let you use column A or column B if your appliances, cooking appliances, fall under those columns, and you get to compare it. And if the column A or B yields the lower result than what you would get in column C, guess what? I get to use the one that yields the best result. That's unique for the NEC because everywhere else, usually you have to take the higher value, right? But when it comes to ranges, this example, you get to take whatever yields the lower value. Just remember that when it comes to ranges, okay? Again, go watch that video on our on Fast Track's Tube about ranges. You'll get it. All right, so notice that note 1 says over 12 through 27, and then note 2 says over 8 3/4 through 27 when you have ranges of unequal ratings, okay? That type of thing. None of which apply to ours. The only one that applies or can apply is note 3. All right, so now let's do, we already know what it would be for the column C, right? Pretty straightforward. Since we have two appliances right here, which is the cooktop and the oven, then we just go to 2 and we come over here to the right, and that would be 11 kW. So if you wanted to use 11,000 VA, I guess you could do that in the real world if that's what you want to do, but that on an exam would not be the right answer because the right answer would be whatever yields you the best result. So in our case, we're going to be looking at column B and seeing what it yields. All right, so we have two appliances, right? And what does it say for note 3? Well, let's read it a little more. It says, in lieu of the method in column C, I can use column A or column B, and it says, by adding the nameplate ratings of all household cooking appliance rated more than 1 3/4, and both of ours are, but not more than 8 3/4, and none of ours are. So you add the sum of them together and multiplying the sum, that means adding the two together, by the sum of the demand factor specified in column A or column B for a given number of appliances shall be permitted. Now, by chance you had a load calculation where one of the appliances fall under column A and one happened to fall under column B, then you would take the one appliance and apply the percentage to that one appliance, and you take the other appliance that falls under B and apply the percentage for one appliance to it, and then you add the two together. But since both of ours fall under column B, we can add both of them together and treat them as two appliances, and we get to apply a 65% demand factor, right? So in our case, what are we going to do? Let's go back to the lesson. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the 7,000, which is 7 kW, is 7,000 watts. And we're going to add the 6,000 for the oven. That gives us 13,000, right? And then we're going to multiply that by 65%, because that was the multiplier for those two appliances under column B. So times 0.65, and that gives me 8,450 VA. So now, is 8,450 less than 11,000? Absolutely. So which am I going to use? I'm most certainly going to use the yielded result from column B, okay? So that is 8,450 for my cooking. Now, I'm going to write that down. But before we leave here, what are we going to do? Remember that neutral? Remember what we said? We get to take it at 70%? I'm going to take that 8,450 and I'm going to multiply that by 70% to get my neutral. Since I'm already here, might as well knock it out. So I'm going to do that 8,450 times 0.70, and that gives me 5,915. Don't believe me? There it is. right there. Okay, so I'm going to write that out here to the side. Okay, I'm just going down the form, writing my neutral as I go, doing my load calc as I go, and that's how you use these forms if you're in our program. Definitely think you should use them. But that's how you use note 3 when you're comparing, okay? All right, so next thing we're going to move on to is the air conditioning loads. Now, one of the things that I tell people all the time is when we're doing a dwelling unit calculation and we talk about something called a non-coincident load, we always like to use AC versus heat because typically they're thermostatically controlled. So when the heat's on, the AC's not. When the AC's on, the heat's not. But I want people to remember that if we weren't talking about dwellings, if we were talking about a commercial building, then you could have 2 loads, non-coincident loads, that will not be running at the same time. And as long as I sized my circuit for the largest or sized my loading for the service for the largest one, so as long as I sized it to the largest and the other one would never come on at the same time, so even if the lesser one's running, since I sized it to the larger and there was some kind of interlock that kept those from operating at the same time, then that's called a non-coincident load. And so I only have to count for the largest one. In a dwelling unit, the easiest example for us is the AC versus heat, right? So when we're doing that, we want to calculate the heat and we want to calculate the AC. Okay, now I'm going to show you what happens when you have a heat pump here in a second. But this is probably more often what you've got on an exam is you've got central heating, which is basically a heat package that's in line with your air handler. And then, of course, you have the air conditioning with the outside air conditioning unit, the condenser, fan, as well as the compressor. And then, of course, you have an air handler, which blows not only the heat, but also blows the AC. And that's what we have in our situation in this one here, okay? Now, if it was baseboard heat, then the National Electrical Code tells us to take that space heating at 100%. So you just add that value to your calculation, okay? You get no reduction to that. You just add it in as you're adding things up. That would be just something else that you have to add in your calculation because you don't get, under the standard method, you don't get any relaxation when it comes to that. It's basically at 100%, okay? So keep that in mind. But in our case, we have like central heating and cooling, so we definitely have some non-coincident loads. Another thing I will tell you up front is that air handler, that is not a non-coincident load. Why? Because it has to be running when the heat is going to blow that air, and it has to be running when the air conditioning is going to blow the cooling around the building, right? So at the end of the day, it is not a non-coincident load. So when we're comparing the different loads, the heating versus AC loads, we got to make sure that the air handler is added to both in our comparison, okay? All right? So let's look and see what we've got here. Now remember, we're going to be doing the 2023 edition of the NEC, so it's important. Pay attention. All right, so first thing we're going to do is we need to convert these things into VA. Well, let's do the heating first. The heating, we don't have to really do any conversion. It's already 15,000 watts, so we already got that. But that air handler is 3.2 amps at 115 volts. So we're going to convert that into a VA. So we're going to take that 3.2 times 115, and that is 368. So you can see that right here. We already done that, okay? Now, and we did that 3.2 times 115. Okay, now that load is going to be on regardless of whether heat or AC. So since we're looking at the heat, we take that 15,000 and we add that 368 to it. So simple, our heating load is 15,368. Now, most savvy electricians that are doing these load calcs looks at this and goes, well, I don't even have to do the calculation for the air conditioning, right? Because it is not going to be anywhere close to that heat. But you may be somewhere in the country where, like Florida, where you might not have this massive 15 kW emergency heat or something like that. You may not have those type of things, or even have that 15 kW central heat package. So the AC may be the larger of the two, but that's why we have to compare. So in our situation, 15,368 is going to be larger than the AC, but we still have to do the math to determine that. So let's look at the AC. So the AC's air conditioning compressor, that is 16.6 amps. Y'all know the drill. That would be 16.6 amps times 230, because that's what they give us. Don't use 240, use 230. That's what they give us, so that's what we want to use. So that equals 3,818, okay? Next is the condensing fan motor. That is 2 amperes, that 2 amps times 115 volts, that's 230, okay? So that's 230 for the condensing fan. And we already know what the air handler was. That's 368. So we're going to add all these up. So 3818 plus 230 plus 368. So that gives me 4,416. Now, what does it say in the 2020 and the 2023 when it comes to looking at this non-coincident load? Now, we really don't have to do this on our calculation, but you may have to. So listen up. Listen how we do this. So 220.60 is going to say, you know what? If you're comparing these two non-coincident loads and the lesser of the two loads contains the largest motor in the dwelling, then you need to redo the calculation and take the largest motor at 125% plus the sum of the other motors associated with it, and then compare that to the heat and see if it overtakes the heat. Well, in our case, it ain't gonna come close. But in the 2020 and 2023, you have to go through that little exercise. Now, for me, immediately, since I know that it wasn't larger than the heat, I would have immediately did the air conditioning compressor and taken that 3818 at 125% plus the 230 and the 368. I would have just done that immediately, okay? And that is probably the best thing you should do. But in this case, I'm going to do that. So I'm going to take that 3818 times 1.25, which is 4772.5, plus 230 plus the 368. That is 5,370.5. Even if I rounded that to 5,371, it is nowhere near the heat. It's not even really a third of the heat. So guess what? I get to take that air conditioning loads and get rid of it. It's gone. I'm going to go with the heat. Make sense? All right. So my load value that I'm going to be plugging in here into line, let's see here, 13 of my form is going to be 15,368. Okay, so 15,368. Okay. Now, while I'm here, we're still doing the neutral, right? You with me? When it comes to the neutral loads in AC, there is no competition between AC and heat when it comes to the neutral. Because if the AC is running, you're going to be using neutral loads, whether it's the condensing fan or the air handler. When the heat's running, yeah, the heating's using 230 or 240. It's not using a neutral, but the air handler will be. So my neutral contribution has to include the air handler and the condenser fan. So while we're doing this neutral contribution, I might as well write it down while I'm here. So all I'm going to do is take that 230 VA that was for the condensing fan, and I'm going to take that 368, which is for the air handler, and that is going to be 598. That is my neutral contribution for all of the heating and air conditioning applications. Again, just the neutral. Because y'all know that the air conditioning compressor does not use a neutral, neither does the electric heat. Okay? So I'm going to write that down as my neutral contribution, and that is 598 VA. Okay? So, kind of what it looks like. If you're following along, you see me filling out this form. And I have a lot of students who actually laminate these and they keep it in their code book. I still, believe it or not, there's a lot of people out there that still have to do load calculations on a daily basis, or you're the person in the company that has to do that. All right, real quick, I want to talk about when you're dealing with a heat pump. A heat pump with supplementary heat is not considered a non-coincident load. So when you're adding this in, you just simply add the compressor's full load current to the maximum amount of heat that can be energized while the compressor is running. Remember, it includes all associated motors, blowers, condensers, and all of that. Typically, you're going to go to that. Now, we're not talking about the optional method, okay, which have some allowances that you can follow for heat pump applications. Here, a heat pump is not a non-coincident load. In many occasions, the heating, supplemental heat, can be on while the heat pump is actually running. So you're going to be definitely pulling the information from the nameplate, and you're going to be taking into account any of that supplementary heat as well in your calculation. All right? So just want you to remember that. Just remember, heat pumps are not considered a non-coincident load. Okay? Just kind of a little extra tip there when you're dealing with a heat pump application. Just take the values from the actual heat pump, which should also have that, and look for any supplemental heat package that may be associated with that, and make sure you add that into your calculation for the heat, okay? Still going to compare it to the AC, right? But you need to remember that. But again, since it's a non-coincident, it means that you're going to have to take your AC. I shouldn't have said compare it. You're going to have to take your AC. If you have any supplemental AC or whatever, maybe like those mini splits or something, if the heat pump's not good enough for you, then you got to take those into consideration. If you have a heat pump, typically you're not going to compare anything, heat or AC. You're going to take what? You're going to take the heat pump's value and use it for your calculation. There is nothing really to compare. Okay? Let's see here. Okay. All right, so in our case, we took it. So we're pretty much got all of our values. All right, so we've got everything that we see here. But we're not done yet. We're not done yet. This is the one that confuses a lot of people. We got one more step. We have to find the largest motor. Now, this is interesting because so many people get confused by this, and they go, Paul, where does it say in the code to take the largest motor at 125%? You got to bear with me here and follow me. Okay, if you take anything away from this, what we're doing is saying, look, this house has motors. And the rules in 430.24, when you have multiple motors, and we have multiple motors in this house, in this building, right? It says to take the largest motor at 125% and the sum of all the other motors at 100%. Well, remember earlier when we were taking into account all these appliances? We actually took all the motors at 100%. Now, granted, we did apply some demands, but we've already accounted for these motors. But we never took any of these motors at 125%. So when you go look at 220.50, put a little star next to that if you want, it reminds us to look at 430.24, which is where you have multiple motors. And it reminds us to take the first motor at 125%, but we haven't taken any motor at 125%. At best, we've taken them at 100%. So we got to get that little 25% somewhere, right? Somewhere. So what do we do? All right, well, let's go look at the code, because this is one of the most confusing areas of the code for people. Let's go look at 220.50 and see where we get that language. Right here. Motors and air compression equipment. Okay, motors. We got some motors. So it says the motors, the conductor sizing required, specified in 430.24 and 430.25, and the feeder demand factor calculating methods in 430.26 shall be used to determine the motor loads. Okay, but we're under a load calculation. So that's what gets us to 220.50. So and if we go to 430.24, if you're familiar with motors, like I told you, it says take the largest motor at 125%. We haven't done that, okay? We haven't done that anywhere. So as we kind of scroll down here and get down to what we're doing in all of our calcs, you know, we're getting down here and we say, okay, we have to account for 220.50. We don't have that 25% yet, right? So we got to find it. All right, now, in our case, this is where you got to think. Remember when we did the AC, which is the largest motor in the building, that air conditioning compressor, right? But we compared AC versus heat, right? Well, guess what we did to that AC loads? We got rid of it. We threw it away. We kept the heat. So we're not going to go after that air conditioning motor now. We have to now go for the next largest motor, right? Next largest motor. And in our equation, as you see on the screen, the next largest actual motor is a in-sync waste disposer. And that was 1,127 VA. Oh, 1,127 VA. Now, we only want 25% of that, right? Because we already took it at 100%. Even though we got the luxury of applying a 75% demand to it, doesn't matter. We already have it figured in. So all I want to do is to meet code, I need that extra 25%. So I'm going to take that 1,127. I'm going to multiply that by 25% or 0.25. I always like to break things down into decimals. Makes it easier for the math. And that means it's going to be a 281.75. We're going to round that to 285. That is my 25% to the largest motor contribution. And again, people say, well, why did we not use the AC? Because that is the largest motor. Because we discounted that entire load when we did AC versus heat. So it's gone. That's why we're hunting for the next largest motor. And that's what we got the in-sync waste disposal. That makes sense. I hope it. And if you don't believe me, you have to have a leap of faith here. That is exactly how it does. I've been teaching this for 38 years. That is how it works, okay? So we need to add that as the largest motor. So I'm going to write this down here. And it's 282. And that is the largest motor. Now, also when it comes to the neutral, you still have to do the same thing. You have to do the largest motor. And so that is where we're going to get 282 also applies because that motor is a 115 volt motor. So it does have neutral loads, right? So that last step for the neutral is it definitely accounts for what? 282 amps. So I'm going to write that down as 282 for my neutral. Okay. So far, this is what it should look like to you folks. Look how I filled this all out. And look, I've got neutral loads right there beside it. We'll verify those here in a second, but we're good to go. Okay? All right. So what's the last step? We have to add all this up. Easy peasy. So there's our loads. We've got 7,048. So 7,048 plus we've got, and that includes all the general lighting, general use, receptacles, small appliance and laundry, and we applied a demand factor to that. We have the fastened in place appliances. We applied a demand factor to that. So let's add that, 6,929. We had the clothes dryer, which we had at the nameplate, which was greater than 5,000. So we added that, 5,500. We had the cooking, if you remember, it was 8,450. We had the AC versus heat, and obviously the heat won. So we have 15,368. And then we have that largest motor at 282. So that should give me 43,577. Exactly what I have here, exactly what you should have as well. All right, we added all that up. Now, on our form, we simply transfer that down to line 16. And, well, wait a minute. The total actually goes on line 15. Let me write that down. 43,577. Then that translates down to line 16, 43,577. I sure hope you guys are using these forms. We also know that it's 240 volt system, so we write 240 down. And so we're basically, we're doing the math right there. See it right here? So now we're going to just take 43,577 divided by 240. And if you got any questions, in a minute, we'll go to the comments and we'll do some questions. 43,577 divided by 240. That gives me 181.57 amps, 0.5 or greater. We're going to round this to 182. So that is the actual load that I need to make sure I have a conductor sized for. Okay, so I have 182 amps. Okay, now, first thing that we need to do now is I need to size the overcurrent protected device. Now, you and I both know that there is no overcurrent device that is 182 amps. Lucky for us, 240.4b of the NEC says that if it's not over 800 amps, and we're not supplying a branch circuit, which we're not, we're doing a load calc, and a breaker doesn't correspond or a fuse doesn't correspond, then we can go up to the next standard size. Now, we still have a conductor that is sized to handle the load, which is 182, so that's still got to be done, but we are allowed to go up to the next standard size. So what I'm going to do, before we even see the answer, let's go to the NEC, and I'll go back real quick and show you where it says that. Bear with me. Let's see here. I'm visually struggled, folks, so I'm half blind anyway. So let's see. So 240.4. So just where you see B, since we know it's not over 800 amps, right? And we're not dealing with a branch circuit, right? And it doesn't correspond to the standard size breaker because me and you both know there isn't one at 182. And the next standard size does not exceed 800, then we're allowed to what? Go to the next standard size, right? All right, so where do we get that? Is right here. Here's your standard sizes. I'll break this out so you can see it. Boom. All right, so you notice there isn't any 182 here, so we get to jump up to 200 amps. So our service rating, okay, our service rating is 200 amps. So we have a 200 amp breaker, the 200 amp marking on it. We have a load that we calculated at 182. So now we have to say, okay, what do I size the conductors at? Okay, so here we got to focus. You could go running over to 31016, folks, and simply go to the 75-degree column because of terminal limitations and temperature limitations of 110.14c and say, okay, I'm just going to find me a conductor that can handle 182 amps and be done with it. But there's something you got to remember. This is not an exception. But in the code, if it's a 100 through 400 amp service, it's a 3-wire 12240 volt for a single family dwelling in our case, that you're allowed to apply some rules that are in 310.12. And we refer to these rules as the 83% rule. Now, this is going to yield usually a one size smaller than what you get in 31016. And it's okay. Now, in the 2023 edition, you got a nifty little table. So in the 2020, I think you do as well. Prior to that, you had to go to Informative Annex D, and it was under D7 example. But it's basically called the 83% rule. And it's 83% of what's marked on the actual breaker. Okay, I'll use a breaker, keep it simple, on the breaker or fuse rating. Okay, so you'll be 83% of that. And the conductor cannot be smaller than the 83% of the rating. Okay. Now, if you have adjustment or corrections, you got to account for that. And it might cause you to go to a bigger size conductor because after those adjustment and corrections, you still can't have a conductor that's less than what? 83% of the rating of the service or feeder. Makes sense? Okay. So now in the code, it's done for us. It's pretty easy, right? But we have to see what it is. So let's kind of look at the code really quickly, and I want to show you. But my key to pointing this out is because you don't want to think that that's an exception. That is not an exception. That is a rule. And I would say you use it in all cases, especially in an exam. So here's the table. It's nifty. And it's basically if you have no conditions of use to apply. It means I don't have any more than 3 current carrying conductors, or I don't have an ambient temperature other than 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, then I can go straight to this table, okay? Usually the ambient is what would be in effect, but I don't know how many of you people do that. Really, I asked this all over the country, and nobody does, even though they're supposed to. And you're usually never going to have more than 3 current carrying conductors for a typical service, especially a resident, so that usually doesn't come into play. But the ambient could come into play, but ironically, I just don't see many people taking it into account, but you're supposed to. On an exam, it could come into play, so be aware of that. So down here, let's look. So ours is a 200 amp. That's what the rating was, service and feeding rating. So in that case, it's a 2-aught copper or a 4-aught aluminum. And that is very indicative of what you see with an SCU cable, where you usually get 4-aught aluminum, that type of thing, okay? So there you go. So then you would just pull that from there, and that's pretty straightforward. That conductor the table tells us right away what we have to do, okay? Now that was for services, that's A, as you see right here, but there's also a B for feeder, typically the same rules, 83%, that type of thing, all right? It's not brain surgery when it comes to that. Just want to make sure you know to apply it, okay? Now, how do you do this? To show you this works, how do you do this if I didn't have this nifty table? Well, again, it's pretty simple. All you do is take the 200 and you multiply it by 83% or 0.83. So I have 200 multiply 0.83, and that gives me 166. So under the 75-degree column, I need to make sure that I have a conductor that is at least rated 166 amps. So if I were to go and look, just for us to look, and I pull this up, and I go down under the 75 degree because of 110.14c terminals and temperature limitations. I'm going to come down here, and I need a conductor that's good for at least 166. Well, this 1-aught's not going to work. 2-aught's good for 175, and you see that that just happens to be a 2-aught as well. So you don't really need that table to understand it, but you do need to know how to get away from that table and to be able to apply adjustments and corrections. And we have a video over on Fast Track's Tube that explains this. It's called Derating Demystified. So if you're confused at this and how you would apply adjustment or corrections to this application, make sure you go watch that video. It's over on our platform, okay? All right, so in our situation now, here, we did it. We found this 200, okay? We had 182 amps, we're good to go. And we're applying it. And so it was 166 amps. We went and looked, okay? So in our case, it's a 2-aught copper or a 4-aught aluminum, okay? Now, if I ask you as a bonus question, now that we know all this stuff, and I said to you, what is the minimum size grounding electrode conductor to a water pipe grounding electrode? Assume it's supplemented. So again, I don't need anybody to say, well, a water pipe ground requires a supplemental electrode. Yeah, we know that. I'm only asking you what's the size that you would run to the water pipe electrode if you had one. Not a trick question. You just need to remember that you're going to go to table 250.66 based on the size of the conductors that we have here, which is the 2-aught copper, okay? If it had said it was a ground rod, then you would go to 250.66A, and it wouldn't be larger than a 6 copper, that type of thing, or a 4 aluminum, right? Got to worry about the aluminum, though, because you can't terminate it within 18 inches of the earth, so nobody uses aluminum for that. They use copper. But you get my drift. I have a video on that, too, over on Fast Track's Tube. So anyway, so let's size this. So let's go real quick to 250.66 and see what it would be for 2-aught copper. And the reason we're going to the table is because in order to deviate from the table, you have to be going to a ground rod pipe or plate, to a concrete encased electrode, or to a ground ring. And then you have some separate allowances in 220.66 A, B, or C. If it's any other type of electrode, you're going to go to the table, okay? So let's go real quick. We have a great grounding and bonding course, by the way, too. If you want to feel free to show your support, we'd love to have you in that program as well. All right, so here's the table. 250.66. And you'll notice up here it's based on the conductor sizes. Or if you have parallel conductors because you're running multiple sets, then you take only one conductor from each set, let's say phase A, and you add them together. For example, if it was 3 sets and there was 500 kc mil in each raceway, like ABC, 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 then you would take the phase A, that'd be 500 plus 500 plus 500. Okay, that's 1,500, what you're going to be using. So if I do that, it would be 500 times 3, and it is 1,500. It was what we're using in VA, okay? All right. And so then you would come over here, and you would obviously see that in that scenario, it is over 1,100. And if that's the case, you just 3/0 is the maximum size you'd need. You don't have to go larger than that, okay, when it comes to the grounding electrode conductor, okay? Now, in our case, it was a 2/0. So we're just right here. 2/0 copper, so it would be a 4 gauge. So the size of our grounding electrode conductor to our water pipe ground would be a 4 gauge copper, okay? It's a minimum size for that, okay? Make sense? Okay. All right, so this is an example I just went through where you take the 200 and multiply it by 83%, and that's how we got the 166. Okay, this most certainly applies here. This is an example of a feeder application, which we didn't look at, but the same rules apply. That if this is a service coming in and this is the feeder, and it's seeing, this feeder is seeing 100% of the load. And obviously it is. Everything in this panel is going to be going through this feeder. Then we're allowed to apply the 83% as well to the feeder application, okay, for these conductors as well. All right, same rules apply, okay? Now, and we already did that. Now, that neutral, just so you can see it real quickly, because we did it, figured it out. These are all neutral loads. These are the neutral loads. You saw that we took only the heat, the air handler, and we took the fan. Remember those values that we calculated earlier? We didn't wait to do it. So there's that 748, check. There's that 3,554 that we got, check. See how we did the math? There's the clothes dryer and the cooking. All of those were done at the 70% of their 5,500 and 8,450. That's how we got the 3,850 and the 5,915. That's what we got written down here. There you go. I can show you. That's what we have right there. Check. And there's the air handler and the condensing fan, the 585. As you can see, that's what we got down there. You can see it under that 5915. Check. And that largest motor that we still have to take into consideration for, don't forget that. We looked at it all, and again, it still was the same situation when it came to neutrals. The largest motor was that same thing as before, is that in-sink waste disposer. That's where that 282 came from. And as you can see, that is our value down there. So when it comes to the neutral, we're adding all of these neutral loads up. As you can see, we added everything up here, and that was 21,247. Obviously, we multiply that by 240, just like we did before. I'll do that as well. And we're running close to my time, so bear with me. I'll take us over just a little bit. And I'm going to divide that by 240, and that gives me 89.27, okay? I believe that's what it gives me. So that gives me, so we're just going to go to 89, okay? So 89, I don't know if that math is right. Hold on here. 21,247 divided by 240 equals 8852, I'm sorry. And we're going to round that to 89. So that is what our neutral load is, okay? So we have to have a conductor that can handle at least 89 amps, okay? So if we go to 31016, we're under the 75-degree column, we have to have a conductor that can handle at least 89 amps. So I think if you go to the NEC, and we'll do that really quickly since we're already invested in this, and hopefully you folks are getting something out of it and appreciate it. If you are, give us some thumbs up. I appreciate it. Okay, doesn't take but a little bit of effort to be, to appreciate it. And so here under the 75, I need something that's good for 89 amps. Oh, that 4 is not going to work. Oh, it's so close, but not going to cut it. So this 3 gauge is what we're going to need. And of course, if it was aluminum, that would be a 2 gauge. So we're perfectly acceptable for that. Now, one last tidbit. In the code, it tells us in 250.24D1 that your neutral cannot be less than what's in the table in 250.102C1. So we just sized our neutral based on the calculated load. But in no case can it be less than what's in 250.102C1. Well, we just calculated and said it couldn't be less than a 3. So what is it supposed to be the minimum that it could be under 250.102C1? What's the minimum? And you get that from 250.24D1, by the way. It makes that reference to 250.102C1. The code is kind of weird like that. So let's go look real quick at 250, just so we can see what it is. 250.102, right here. And we're going to go down. Here's the C1. So here's the table. Now, what you'll notice about this table is, you see right here what it says? Grounded conductor. So think of this table as a minimum size. It can't be smaller than this, but it may be larger because you have to do a load calculation. And in our case, our load calculation yielded a 3. So what does it say down here? Well, remember what our conductor was? It was a 2-aught ungrounded conductor, right? See, we're dealing with ungrounded conductor. It was a 2-aught. So it says that the minimum grounded conductor has to be at least a 4. Well, our calculation yielded a 3. And y'all all know the way it goes in the American wire gauge. A 3 is larger than 4. So we're going to go with our calculated load, and that's why we're using the 3 AWG, right? And that's how we got it there, okay? So that's how we got it there. That's just a lot of information in a 2-hour webinar. Let me bring it back to me. Well, you know what? I'll take a few minutes here. I know we're over, and I appreciate you hanging with me, but I'll go to any questions. Let's see here. You're most appreciative. I'm glad you enjoyed it. There you go. Keep pushing. And yep, I hope I go as in depth as sometimes I go too deep. People let me know. Trust me. I got my share of haters, but is what it is. There's no doubt I'm going to get a thumbs down for this just because I got my share of haters. Let's see here. Leonardo says, all best regards to you. You're awesome. Much appreciated. You're most welcome, my friend. I sure hope that you definitely get something out of it. Daryl, as always, I know that you appreciate it, and I appreciate you for joining me. Let's see here. Say, Ball 316, thank you for responding to my question about the electrical inspection test. You're most welcome. Hopefully I did. Let's see here. Sal from Texas, right down the road, kinda. Down a little south down there. Thank you for joining me as well, Sal. I appreciate it. All right, folks, that's it for today's webinar. I hope you got something out of it. And again, make sure you keep your eyes open for another webinar, which the next one will be the optional method. And we will cover everything about that. If you got any questions, make sure that you bring them up. And don't forget to go watch my video that's on today at 4 o'clock. That'll be streaming. Make sure you go watch that. That's talking about motor branch circuits and not the normal, whereas people know that you just do 125% of the FLC. But we want to make sure that you understand that if there is an adjustment or correction due to ambient temperature or more than 3 current conductors, you got to take that into consideration as well. So we're going to cover that today. So make sure you check that out, okay? So, and Richard, last question I'll take here is, when I move to the East Coast, yes, it always moves with me. So when I move to the East Coast, everything will move to Eastern Standard Time. But right now, it's Central Standard Time. So yes, it will probably move because that's where I will be, all right? All right, folks, I appreciate you all. Until next time, stay safe. God bless, and we'll catch you on a future webinar. And if you want more information about our programs, just visit our website, fasttracksystem.com. Fast Tracks, T-R-A-X, system.com. Take care. God bless.